Okay. Hello, welcome to the second day of the Channel 4 conference. Welcome to those of you here in person, and welcome to the people I'm sure who are also online. We're here today for a panel on Scotland and Channel 4, but before I introduce the panelists, I've had an emergency message about some changes to the programme today. I'm afraid there's been a few changes and dropouts, so I'm just going to go through the changes in the programme if you want to just take note of them. The 12 to 1 session in the Blue Room, Sylvia Harvey is now going to have Rod Stoneman as a respondent. Rod has just pulled a face, so I hope he knows that. Rod was a commissioning editor in the Department of Independent Film and Video, so no better person to respond to the question of whether Channel 4 is still fulfilling its remit. On the parallel panel at 12 to 1 in NFT 3, James Fenwick has had to pull out due to a family tragedy. So I'm afraid he won't be here. We've also had another change. Sorry, my phone is playing up here. But I can see it's the 2 to 3:45 panel in the Blue Room. David Lee and Catherine Champion have failed to get here from Glasgow. So there's just going to be Nathan and Andrew on the 2 to 3:45 panel. So Andrew, you can add a few more minutes to your presentation, I guess. You're not going to be short of time. But the good news is that Richard Tate on Channel 4 News is going to continue as advertised 4 to 5. So there's changes to nearly every panel that follows this one. So that's the latest news there. Well, now let's get on to today's proceeding. We've got a panel on Scotland and Channel 4. I've also got notes just to remind you that the panels will take place in the order that they're shown in the programme. We take questions at the end of the panel rather than at the end of papers, though in this case, two of our speakers will be giving a joint presentation. So in fact, there's only two presentations, but there will be three speakers. We can also take questions from the remote audience because chats will be monitored. So if you are watching on YouTube and you have a burning issue, or if you are sitting in Glasgow unable to get here and want to respond, please do so on YouTube and we can deal with those questions. Our speakers then will begin with Johnny Murray. Johnny Murray is a senior lecturer in film and visual culture at Edinburgh College of Art. He's well known for a range of writing on Scottish film and television, and will today be talking about FilmFour and its contribution to Scottish production and representation. He'll then be followed by ALISTAIR SCOTT NELSON CORREA. ALISTAIR is an associate professor of film and TV at Edinburgh Napier University. That follows a long career as a producer and director in broadcasting, working for BBC and Channel 4. And he now writes about television policy, the history of Scottish television, and questions of policy around production and the labour force in Scotland. He'll be presenting with Nelson, who's a PhD student jointly supervised by Edinburgh Napier and Edinburgh College of Art, which I think is part of Edinburgh University now. And he's doing a PhD on 40 years, I think it is, of freelance employment in the Scottish production industry, which seems quite a tall order. Apparently, he's still at relatively early stages, and this is his first public presentation. So hope that it's going to go well for him, and looking forward to hearing what his preliminary research has revealed. So our first presenter then is Johnny, or formerly known as Jonathan Murray, who's going to talk about Film on 4 and Scotland. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you everyone for giving up some time on a Saturday morning to hear us speak. I'm going to speak for around about half an hour because we've got quite a long slot and only 2 papers. I will intersperse the monotony with 3 clips, and I'd just like to thank the technical staff supporting today's event because they've done some magic at short order to allow me to show the clips because they're not actually embedded properly by me in the PowerPoint, so thank you for that. Okay, so to begin, within received historical accounts, it's possible to talk about Channel 4 without mentioning Scottish cinema. But it's much harder to talk about Scottish cinema without mentioning Channel 4. The 2 most historically important expansions of Scottish feature film production, the first dating roughly between 1981 and 1985, and the second between 1994 and 2001, were both dependent on the broadcaster's sustained financial support, and their respective ends were coterminous with its patronage moving elsewhere. And that's the period I'll talk about today, 1982 to 2001. What I hope to try and demonstrate, even if in very sketchy provisional form in this paper, is that an historical relationship which at first sight looks like a comparatively one-sided relationship of dependence was actually considerably more complicated than that. So to begin, from its inception, Channel 4 pursued a dedicated policy of funding British feature film production through, initially, its drama department's commissioning remit. Of the 28 British features Channel 4 part or fully funded in its first year of operation, 5 were Scottish. But Barney Platt's Mill's Hero, Michael Radford's Another Time, Another Place, Charlie Gormley's Living Apart Together, Bill Bryden's Ill Fares the Land, and Murray Grigor's Scotch Myths. The received story of Scottish cinema in the 1980s tends to be that of national hopes pinned on one man, writer-director Bill Forsyth. But the story might be better perceived as a tale of national hopes pinned on one broadcaster, Channel 4. Prior to the 1980s, the absence of what Rod Allen, writing in Broadcast magazine in February 1976, termed, quote, the Scottish industry as a definable entity within a wider British context had been the most obvious thing to strike observers. Channel 4's emergence promised to change that. But what is interesting about local reaction to Channel 4's early Scottish feature funding activities is the extent to which, arguably, these were welcomed in Scotland less as things which accelerated the emergence of the Scottish industry as a definable entity, and more as external interventions that might abnegate the need for such an entity in the first place. Rather than focusing on the strategic collective playing of the national card, as proved to be the case in Wales, an emergent Scottish cinema was locally conceived, or maybe perhaps better, locally conceived of itself as an agglomeration of heroic individual cineasts who could now directly access a new long-term stream of metropolitan production funding. A flavour of that thinking, and of how it started to change and evolve as the 1980s progressed, can be gained from considering the work of the only 1980s Scottish feature film director to gain Channel 4 funding more than once, the late Charlie Gormley. Take, for example, Gormley's 1982 movie Living Apart Together. This isn't simply a Scottish film made possible by Channel 4. It's one that self-consciously offered a suggestive contemporary vision of what a Scottish cinema made possible by Channel 4 could or should look like. And if at this stage we could have the first clip, so the opening moments of Gormley's Living Apart Together.
numbers of the Richie Hanna Band. I know you're all terribly disappointed, but we have to go home now. Go and take these girls with me. See you all again sometime. Thank you, good night.
Great, Richie. I'll battle a bit tonight, huh?
It was okay. Good audience, right?
Good audience, we...
So my apologies for admitting the content warning about 1980s fashions. The form of Channel 4 supported Scottish cinema that I think a movie like Living Apart Together both instantiates and implies was that of a national cinema dominated by the central idea of the expressive and therefore exceptional individual artist. Living Apart Together's central character, Richie Hanna, is, for example, introduced within the movie as, quote, Scotland's #1 singer-songwriter. The fledgling nature of Richie's artistic and commercial reputations and the particular models of national scale in which they play out make him seem uncannily reflective of the manner in which contemporary Scottish feature filmmakers of the early 1980s were represented, often by themselves, within industrial and popular discourse. This film centres around two agential figures, both understood primarily in terms of their activities and aspirations as artists. One, Richie, is a fictional surrogate for the material other, writer-director Charlie Gormley. Living Apart Together emphasises the idea of the Scottish artist, fictional or otherwise, as a public figure in a transitional phase in various ways. That idea is given concrete form in the film's opening scene, which you've just seen, a concert that Richie gives in Newcastle, the nearest major city to the Scotland-England border. And that idea of crossing borders from one small market into a much larger one, I think is quite important for this movie and many of the other contemporaneous Scottish work that was produced around the same time. Richie later boasts, while we're on the metaphor of border crossing, of his first success in what he calls, quote, the real, in other words, the British singles chart, as opposed to the tartan, or Scottish equivalent. It's also revealed quite quickly on in the film that his manager is on the verge of signing him a lucrative deal with a major London-based record label. Most obviously of all, however, the casting of real-life Scottish singer-songwriter B.A. Robertson in the film's lead role deliberately blurs the dividing line between fictional surrogates and real-life contemporary Scottish artists on the rise. Strikingly, much of the original early 1980s wave of Scottish feature cinema echoes Living Apart Together in its creation of narratives built around central characters who might be seen as surrogates for the real-life writer-directors who made them. Individuals with uncommon gifts and or goals who struggle with the burden of an unexpected move into the public eye. The films in question don't so much pass comment on the state of Scotland as they do on the state of being someone, film directors say, who is widely expected to pass comment in this way. Living Apart Together's plot, for example, is significantly interchangeable with that of Bill Forsyth's 1984 movie Comfort and Joy. In both films, a prominent local entertainer is abandoned by his romantic partner and searches for her through a glamorised, romanticised, nocturnal version of Glasgow at the prompting of another woman, and whilst also attempting to retain his creative integrity and public profile. In 1985's Restless Natives, two disaffected Edinburgh youths achieve international celebrity when they embark on a career as modern-day highwaymen, robbing coachloads of Highland tourists, many of whom start travelling to Scotland precisely in order to be stolen from. Replacement of personal anonymity with public celebrity alienates them from friends, lovers, and each other. Finally, in Charlie Gormley's other 1980s Channel 4 funded Scottish movie, 1986 Heavenly Pursuits, an atheist teacher at a Roman Catholic school gains unwanted celebrity when he appears to exercise miraculous powers over both his pupils' progress and his own health. A malignant brain tumour he is diagnosed with mysteriously disappears. And all this happens just at the moment when the local church attempts to gain beatification of the nun after whom the school that the teacher works in is named. Early 1980s Scottish films such as these, some funded by Channel 4 and some not, collectively demonstrate the heady extent to which, as the Scottish Film Council's John Brown acknowledged in 1990, Channel 4's film commissioning remit was initially welcomed in Scotland as, quote, a radically new source of money and an outlet for Scottish filmmaking. Yet after the initial flurry of Channel 4 Scottish feature commissions in 1982 to 1983, the broadcaster commissioned only 2 further Scottish features by the decade's end: Heavenly Pursuits, already mentioned, and Gillis McKinnon's Conquest of the South Pole from 1989. For this reason, the scale of local disappointment with Channel 4 at the end of the 1980s matched that of local expectation at the decade's start. In 1989, for example, outgoing Chief Executive Jeremy Isaacs admitted regret that Channel 4 had not, quote, done enough for Scotland, end quote, in terms of production commissions. Meanwhile, Scottish filmmakers were not only arguing that Channel 4's looked-for transformative effects had largely failed to materialise, they also started to try to reconceive the terms on which such a transformative intervention might or should be expected. If the dominant figure within early 1980s Scottish cinema is that of the heroic writer-director, the successor in the decade's latter half is arguably the figure of the pragmatic producer. Individuals like Mike Alexander and Gareth Wardell, who combined entrepreneurial with creative remits by running independent production companies. In Wardell and Alexander's respective cases, Pellicula Films and Jam Jar respectively. Their complaints about Channel 4 at the end of the 80s tended to be structural rather than individual. By round about 1989 to 90, for example, it was widely noted that Channel 4 commissions dispensed annually to Scottish film and television producers only amounted to round about 10% of the annual levy which the broadcaster extracted from Scottish broadcasters' advertising revenues. So I'll move now to a brief discussion of the changing situation again in the 1990s. Channel 4's re-engagement with Scottish cinema in a new decade can be traced to 2 films produced by director Danny Boyle, writer John Hodge, and producer Andrew MacDonald, 1994's Shallow Grave, and Trainspotting from 1996. Channel 4 provided majority funding for Shallow Grave, and its full funding of Trainspotting's £1.7 million production budget was at that point in time its largest ever single feature film investment. Boyle, Hodge and MacDonald shared a keen awareness of and enthusiasm for particular forms of American cinema past and present. Shallow Grave was a remarkable commercial success, selling around 1.5 million tickets and taking round about £5.1 million at the UK box office, becoming the most domestically successful British film of 1995. The film's narrative focuses on arrogant young professionals Alex, David and Juliet, who share a luxurious flat in Edinburgh's Georgian Newtown. Fatally, they lease their spare room to a mysterious, self-confident English writer, who soon after moving in, overdoses on drugs, leaving behind a large bag of cash and no forwarding details. Overcome by greed, Alex, David and Juliet decide to steal the loot, with interesting consequences. And if at this stage we could see the opening moments of Shallow Grave, please.
I'm not ashamed. I've known love. I've known rejection. I'm not afraid to declare my feelings. Take trust, for instance, or friendship. These are the important things in life. These are the things that matter, that help you on your way. If you can't trust your friends, well, what then? What then? This could have been any city. They're all the same.
Shallow Grave is a crucial work within Scottish cinema history for multiple reasons. One of these involves the ingenuity and depth of the film's determination to escape, at that point in time, relatively entrenched expectations that a Scottish movie must automatically or predominantly concern itself with the explicit depiction or interrogation of explicitly Scottish subject matter. Shallow Grave's now relatively famous opening title sequence, which you've just seen an excerpt of here, goes out of its way to proclaim as much. A high-speed, low-angle journey around the unique architecture of Edinburgh's new town is accompanied by an unseen narrator, subsequently revealed to be one of the three flatmates, David, offering the assertion that, quote, "This could be any city, they're all the same." In choosing to start in this way, Shallow Grave immediately begins to accumulate and self-consciously acknowledge creative debts to American cinema. David's voiceover narration, for example, which reappears at the film's very end, is a bookending device that introduces the film's story and situation from a recently deceased man's perspective. While David seems to be resting open-eyed in bed at the start of Shallow Grave, the film's final scene reveals that what viewers saw at this point in the movie was in fact his corpse laid out on a mortuary slab. This self-conscious transposition of the celebrated opening sequence of Billy Wilder's 1950 movie Sunset Boulevard to a contemporary Scottish context is deeply metatextual. Sunset Boulevard is, after all, a classical Hollywood film that explores the perverse glamour which classical Hollywood cinema exerts. Edinburgh's new town is filtered through the prism of a celebrated cinematic myth of Tinseltown. Intensely reminiscent of this deliberately pointed admixture of local and global forms of cinematic culture and its self-conscious crystallization via lead character voiceover, Trainspotting's equally celebrated opening sequence has Ewan McGregor deliver his famous Choose Life monologue in a Scottish Central Belt accent counterpointed by the iconic American drawl of Iggy Pop's Lust for Life. A similar sense of cultural bifurcation is discernible in the movie's final moments. "I'm going to be just like you," McGregor's character, Mark Renton, promises, while breaking the fourth wall as he strides through central London, armed with a hold-all of stolen money and an unshakable sense of self-reliance and self-belief. In his own words, cleaning up, moving on. The fact that Mark crosses a bridge over the River Thames as we hear him say such things only amplifies the presumably intentional sense of Rubicons being crossed, not simply within, but also out with the film itself. In Trainspotting's wake, Boyle, MacDonald and Hodge spent the rest of the 1990s working on high-budget productions supported by Hollywood studio finance. Encouraged by the remarkable success of Shallow Grave and Trainspotting's aggressively aspirant transatlanticism, Channel 4 swiftly re-established itself as arguably the most consistent and extensive provider of production funding for late 1990s Scottish feature cinema. 9 out of the 18 Scottish films produced and themed films released in British cinemas between 1995 and 2000 were part funded by the broadcaster. And Shallow Grave and Trainspotting influenced Channel 4's late 1990s Scottish activities in two main ways. Most obviously, they encouraged the broadcaster to invest in Scottish projects to a degree not previously seen. Yet they also precipitated a marked change in the rationale that had previously underpinned such patronage, whether of Scottish cinema specifically, or British cinema, or perhaps better, British cinemas more generally. If Channel 4's greater financial input into a larger number of Scottish features than ever before proved ostensibly welcome, the rapidly evolving institutional logic that motivated such support quickly came to seem much more problematic for many of its Scottish beneficiaries. Post-Trainspotting, Channel 4 began to distance itself from previously held ideals of supporting A, British feature production that might realistically achieve a significant degree of self-sufficiency within domestic exhibition markets, and B, formally and or politically radical Indigenous cinema more generally. Instead, the broadcaster increasingly sought to reinvent FilmFour, its film production and distribution arm, as an international mini-studio along the lines of Miramax, typically producing medium-budget films intending to cross over from televisual or art house exhibition circuits into the global commercial mainstream. The shift in question can be discerned in the changing rhetorical priorities of the two men who headed FilmFour during the 1990s. In 1996, in the immediate aftermath of Shallow Grave's international box office success, David Auken argued of the film that, quote, its significance lies not so much in its good performance abroad, but in the fact that it was able to recoup its costs within the UK without its success here being powered by an initial success in the USA. The conclusion I draw is that we can make films for ourselves. We need no longer feel overwhelmingly dependent on overseas markets to finance our films. Yet if this was the dominant lesson drawn in 1996, it was one quickly forgotten or repudiated in the years immediately following. In 2001, Paul Webster, Auken's successor at FilmFour since 1998, and the man who oversaw the organisation's reformation as a quasi-independent mini-studio, rationalised its activities in the post-Trainspotting era by arguing that, quote, in maturing the British film industry, what was needed was more of a corporate structure. We worked on the notion of creating a mini-studio, or a microcosm of a studio. There is a bigger plan to make movies globally and build a global business. That's because you can't build a vibrant film business in the UK alone. It's impossible. You can't make any money theatrically or on video, and broadcasters aren't paying what they used to pay. From the point of view of a proper business, you have to work internationally. And we can see here, I think, a high-level sense of ways in which FilmFour's self-image altered rapidly and markedly as the 1990s progressed. And also a sense that Shallow Grave and Trainspotting were not just important milestones, but also important precipitants within that process. As a result of these changes in institutional logic and priorities, many late 1990s Scottish filmmakers who benefited from Channel 4's renewed financial support actually complained about what they saw as the increasingly commercial, internationally focused industrial agenda that was driving it. Peter Mullen, who acted in Trainspotting, saw that film's long-term effects on Scottish and British film industries as equivocal, because Trainspotting had, in his view, created a hyperbolic vision of the UK's ability to compete within the international commercial mainstream. Mullen argued in one interview, quote, for less than a £2 million investment, again, £2 million investment by Channel 4, there was a £90 million return. Not even the maddest Hollywood mogul would expect that percentage of profit, but British funders and producers now do, end quote. Scottish writer and artist John Byrne, whose film adaptation of his play The Slab Boys was also funded by Channel 4, but subsequently not distributed in British cinemas outside of an extremely limited Scottish release, argued something similar. Byrne proposed that Channel 4 was now less interested in cultural diversification of British cinema and more with a Trainspotting-inspired internationally marketable vision of Scotland, and by extension, an internationally marketable vision of what a Scottish film constituted or connoted. Quote, the Slab Boys is not slick or American or violent enough. How do they market something that's not violent or controversial? FilmFour expected Trainspotting, but they should have known. They had the script. Even the author of the original Trainspotting novel, Irwin Welsh, espoused similar worries, acknowledging the extent to which Trainspotting had, in his view, established a restrictive commercial template of a Scottish film, into which metropolitan funders such as Channel 4 increasingly compelled subsequent Scottish filmmakers to try to fit their work. With regard, for example, to Channel 4's expectations for The Acid House, screenwritten by Welsh and adapted from a trilogy of his short stories, Welsh seemed to self-identify in quite literal terms as the author of his own misfortune, arguing that, quote, I think after Trainspotting, which has become a bit of a reference point for just about every British film, that it's very difficult to do something a bit different, a bit less airbrushed, a bit less for the mass market. We wanted our actors to be rougher and speak roughly, but it's very difficult to do that post-Trainspotting, to just do our own daft wee film. So by the end of the 1990s, Channel 4's relationship with Scottish filmmakers had become a paradoxical one. Unlike the story of the 1980s, production finance kept flowing. Yet just like the earlier decade, the end of the latter one saw levels of mutual disappointment and misunderstanding between Scotland and London escalate the longer the working relationship between the two parties lasted. So I'll move now to a brief concluding section. In July 2002, Channel 4 announced the closure of the FilmFour mini studio that it had established in 1998 in order to integrate and expand the broadcaster's film production, distribution and sales activities on an international scale. This decision was made in light of operational losses of £8.4 million sustained by FilmFour between 2000 and 2001, as its attempt to become an internationally successful mini studio along Miramax lines foundered in the wake of box office disappointments such as 2001's Charlotte Gray, a work that we might not immediately think of as Scottish. And if I could have finally just the opening moments of Charlotte Gray at this point. Thank you.
Looking back, it all seems so simple. We were at war. The Nazis were the enemy. And because good must triumph over evil, so we would triumph over them.
In Australian filmmaker Gillian Armstrong's movie, Charlotte is an inexperienced young Scotswoman recruited as a secret agent by Special Operations Executive during World War II. Charlotte accepts a posting in occupied France in significant part because she desires to locate her missing lover, an RAF pilot who's been shot down over that country. But while working in France, she becomes attached to a local resistance leader and eventually moves back there after the war in order to start a new life with him. Industrially speaking, Charlotte Gray probably wouldn't have existed without, and actually I will come back to the brief plot synopsis because it is significant to what I'm going to argue in conclusion. Industrially speaking, Charlotte Gray probably wouldn't have existed without the Channel 4 sponsored upsurge in late 1990s Scottish filmmaking. Firstly, it exemplifies the broadcaster's increasingly preferred post-train spotting strategy of directing an increasing proportion of its resources into medium to high budget projects explicitly geared towards the international commercial mainstream. Secondly, the film was developed by a Scottish filmmaker whose career had been radically transformed by the mid to late 1990s Scottish mini-boom, producer Douglas Ray and his London-based independent production company, Aust Films. A mid-1990s Aust project, 1997's Mrs. Brown, had transcended modest roots as a BBC Scotland television commission to become an Oscar-winning international commercial success, picked up but for North American theatrical distribution by, you guessed it, Miramax. Charlotte Gray tried but failed to replicate its predecessor's exploitation of Scottish-inflected period melodrama as an internationally lucrative proposition. Thirdly and finally, however, the narrative and thematic affinities between Charlotte Gray and Trainspotting are striking. Like Trainspotting, Charlotte Gray is the story of a Scot who leaves their homeland for the European continent. In both movies, that destination is framed as both physical and psychological. To go somewhere new is to actively embrace the possibility of becoming someone else. Charlotte Gray's opening scene therefore recalls Trainspotting's closing one in multiple ways. Charlotte's view through the train window is one of rural flora blurring into a semi-abstract purple swell. A stylized profile shot showcases her alabaster white skin, blood-red millinery, and sky-blue eyes. At the same time, a prominent interior voiceover, another pronounced similarity to Train Spotting, reflects on how, quote, looking back it all seemed so simple. The Nazis were the enemy. Here it seems as an intensely seductive because clear-cut image of national identity and identification. Charlotte's red, white and blue appearance, her Scottish accent, and the absolutist binary through which she cast World War II ostensibly construct her as a Blitz-era Britannia. But the tricolor scheme does not speak solely, or perhaps even primarily, of the character's innate allegiance to her country of birth. Rather, it indicates Charlotte's intense identification with a foreign culture within which she finds herself reborn. The purple backdrop to Private Psychodrama is lavender, not heather. We do not see Charlotte speeding north to Scotland, but south through France to begin a new life. Trainspotting and Charlotte Gray bookend the narratives with sequences of overseas escapes, precisely because they were the work of Channel 4 supported late 90s and early noughties Scottish filmmakers determined to find ways in which to make Scottish inflected films attractive and legible to global audiences. Like the fictional Scottish characters they created, these real-life filmmakers were much taken by the prospect of carving out a secure and sustainable way of living and working within a wider world beyond Scotland's borders. But of course that project proved elusive as well as attractive. Trainspotting's global success led to a moment of bullish cultural and commercial self-confidence that kick-started multiple Scottish filmmaking careers within a 6 to 7 year period. But unable to sustain major losses on Charlotte Gray and a string of other ambitiously budgeted features, FilmFour was wound up less than 6 months after the former film's global theatrical release. Thus, despite Channel 4's undoubted material centrality as a or the major funder of late 1990s and early noughties Scottish cinema, so ambiguous had that centrality become by 2002 that the then chief executive of Scottish Screen could react to FilmFour's demise with something approaching equanimity. Quote, a huge blow to the UK industry, but for Scotland the jury must still be out. Scottish film producers' relationship with Channel 4 and FilmFour was built on low-budget productions, the sort of work FilmFour had moved away from in a quest for international hits. Perhaps our companies will in the future be able to connect more with that original low-budget framework which Channel 4 seems keen to re-establish. The heady aspiration that underwrote Channel 4's presence in late 1990s Scotland proved, like the broadcaster's earlier intervention in the 1980s, to be time-bound in its utility. It also proved to be about much more than simply the gross sum of funding sent north of the border, an observation which should also apply to the historical relationship between Channel 4 and Scotland when conceived more holistically than I've done in this paper today. When examined over a 20-year period, that relationship can't be characterised as a completely one-sided instance of structural dependence. In the 1980s, I would suggest that macrocosmic British metropolitan developments shaped the microcosmic hopes and prospects of filmmakers working in Scotland. In the 1990s, however, it's possible to argue that microcosmic Scottish developments helped shape the macrocosmic hopes and prospects of major British metropolitan film funders such as Channel 4. Acknowledging Channel 4's historic importance for Scotland is relatively easy, but acknowledging Scotland's historic importance for Channel 4 and mapping the complex and consistently evolving nature of the relationship between the two entities is a more challenging but equally necessary historiographical task. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Johnny. That was a very lucid and informative presentation, and probably sets out quite nicely for the next presentation by ALISTAIR Scott and Nelson Correa, who are going to talk about the evolution of the Scottish production sector in relationship to Channel 4. So I'll now hand over to them. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. our presentation will examine the historic relationship between, shall we just put up the slides? Or, excuse me 1 second. I wonder if you can you put up the slideshow? It's coming, right, thank you. Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you, John. And yes, our presentation follows on, I hope, from Johnny's paper on the FilmFour Commission from Scotland. Our presentation is going to examine the wider historic relationship between Channel 4 and the Scottish independent production sector then and now, and investigate how opportunities for Scotland's producers and freelance workforce today compares with the impact of the channel in previous decades. I'm going to give an introduction to the situation today, and then Nelson's going to talk about the preliminary work that he's been doing in a PhD research which is looking at the development of the freelance workforce, particularly in Scotland. And then I'll come back after Nelson's presentation and reflect on the wider implications about nations and regions policy, which I think we can take from the experience in Scotland. At the reception to open the new creative hub in Glasgow, both Alex Mann, Channel 4's chief executive, and Susan Aitken, leader of Glasgow City Council, hailed the initiative as fantastic new opportunity for production growth, talent development in Glasgow and Scotland and across Scotland. And as I stood there mingling with local producers and watching them queue to catch a word in the ear of a Channel 4 commissioning editor, I wondered if this was, from a Scottish perspective, as big a change as was being heralded. Weren't the claims of these speeches conveniently forgetting how the Scottish production sector had worked with the channel back in the 1980s? Many of the new aspirations really date back to those early years. The benefits now promised from the new creative hubs include the development of local production companies in the nations and regions, encouraging commissions to be made outside London, growing and supporting the local freelance sector, and initiatives for talent development and other types of investment. It seemed to me that these had all been familiar themes back in the early days. Of course, the Glasgow Creative Hub, with Joe Street and Deborah Dunnett in residence and commissioning the daytime and popular factual output, is welcome, and hopefully is already increasing opportunities for Scottish-based companies. Nevertheless, the fact that many themes are just the same as in the 1980s raised a number of questions that I'd like to address. Firstly, given that Scotland's production companies and freelancers were arguably a prototype creative cluster at the time of the launch 40 years ago, how come now many of the main stakeholders, such as Screen Scotland, still consider this cluster at an early stage of development? What were the barriers that got in the way of successful ongoing growth? And can these be overcome by the establishment of the Creative Hub? Why is it that we have roughly the same number of production companies based in Scotland who are regularly commissioned by the Channel in the early years, and the same today? Why has no super indie emerged from a Scottish base? And what do we learn by the content of the range of commissions then and now, the kind of subject matter that's dealt with? If we analyse the commissions that the Scottish companies made in the first decade, they often came with a Scottish accent, representing national cultural identity on screen. The kind of national conversation that I think John Ellis was referring to in his paper when he spoke yesterday, and the kind of essence of public service broadcasting. But how does this compare with the commissions and successful formats in the 2020s? The commissions that we see from the major successful companies in Scotland now go out of their way to look like they could be made anywhere in the UK or perhaps even elsewhere as part of the global media enterprise. What does that indicate about how the Channel's shifted from its original remit? As Johnny said at the end of his paper, for the most part, the Scottish output and contribution to the history of the Channel has not really been reflected in scholarship examining the past 40 years. It's not really even a footnote in the 2 volumes by Maggie Brown or the book by Dorothy Hobson looking at the early years. But actually, by focusing attention on the evolution of the relationship with this home nation, the relationship between Channel 4 and Scotland, what do we learn about the changing ethos of the Channel itself? Firstly, Nelson's going to reflect on the impact of the Channel on the Scottish regional workforce in the early 1980s and how this coincided with a period of fundamental change in the Scottish film and television sector.
Thank you. Okay, so in this part of the paper, we're going to look at how early Channel 4 commissions from the 1980s and 90s helped to develop talent across the freelance screen workforce in Scotland. So I'm going to try to show this through analysis of crew credit lists from productions of this period, in particular Scottish feature films from the 1980s that were backed by Channel 4, career biographies of individuals who worked on those projects, and data from the annual Film Bank Directory of Scottish-based freelance crew personnel. As a reference, Film Bank has been published from 1976 to this day. It was created by a group of freelancers as part of a workforce manifesto and became a reference point for the local sector. The directory offers comprehensive listings of crew personnel across departments, production companies, and filming facilities across around Scotland. Given its long history, Film Bank has the potential to provide robust longitudinal evidence to help track the evolution of the workforce, the freelance workforce in Scotland. So here is an overview of the freelance sector in Scotland now. The Scottish screen sector is a prolific regional production hub of feature films, high-end TV, and factual television programming. It's estimated that there are around 3,400 freelancers working in the local sector in production-related activities, plus 2,300 permanent staff. The range of skills of the freelancers spans across all production departments, and the majority are concentrated in the Central Belt, in particular in and around Glasgow, where most of the sector's employers and commissioners, including Channel 4, are also located. Overall, the Scottish freelance pool can be described as interconnected and adaptable. It's common for freelancers to move among the same set of employers and across media and types of projects. Many freelancers in Scotland also tend to work on more than one production genre. As in other parts of the UK, there has been a boom in production activity in Scotland in recent years, which has brought a scope for the expansion of the local freelance pool. This, however, also led to personnel and skill shortage. There are problems, in particular, in craft areas such as camera grip and editing, roles across the art department, direction, and management roles across all production departments. While shortages have also been noticed elsewhere in the UK, they may be aggravated in Scotland since the volatility of production patterns there makes the retention of freelance pool more difficult than it is in larger production centers like London and the southeast of England. There is an awareness of this issue across the local sector. Nevertheless, opportunities for upskilling and retraining still remain limited, in contrast, for example, to entry-level training for which there is a structured network available. So here is an overview of the workforce back then, before the arrival of Channel 4. In the mid-1970s, the freelance screen workforce in Scotland consisted of a small cluster of no more than 70 film crew personnel working a few creative and technical roles. This workforce started to develop in the 1930s, and since then had been involved mainly in the production of sponsored short documentaries for local cinema screening, commissioned by government agencies and industry. This mode of production, however, was becoming unsustainable to the resistance of audience to sponsor content, and there are no other alternatives in sight. In the film sector, there are no structures to fund feature films or any other sort of indigenous production. In television, the local program output was simply not sufficient to require additional freelance workers. And at the same time, strict trade union regulations made the crossover between the two sectors, film and television, quite difficult. Okay, so even so, like many Scottish freelancers of the time had the ambition to venture into feature films and television work, especially the new generation that was emerging at the time. So in this spirit, freelancers decided to come together and campaign for more funding and institutional support for the local sector. The efforts led to the Film Bang Manifesto, launched during a two-day public conference held in Glasgow in 1976, with the help of the sector's union, the ACTT, Association of Cinema and Television Technicians. It was during this event that the Film Bang Director, which I mentioned before, was launched. Okay, the workforce mobilization continued through the 1970s, gaining support from academics, cultural agencies, and lobbying groups on both sides of the border. By the turn of the decade, the first public interventions in the local sector start to appear, including the creation of an entry-level training program in 1978 and the establishment of the Scottish Film Production Fund in 1982 to help the financing of fictional production. However, funding in the local sector was still scarce, and that's when Channel 4 arrived. Okay, Channel 4 emerged as one of the main sources of finance in the local sector. And by placing commissions across various genres and formats, it broadened the scope for freelance employment in the Scottish sector. First of all, it offered freelancers the chance to break into both feature film and television production. And then it created conditions for the expansion and skills diversification of the workforce. Channel 4 also helped with new talent development. Even though it never paid regular subventions to the official Scottish training schemes of the time, it supported alternative routes of access to the industry, such as projects from the workshop movement and the production of short films made by newcomers. Many of the Channel 4 commissions also employed trainees and beginners alongside experienced crews, which enabled the transfer of skills. And the way in which the Scottish freelancers were involved in film projects and television projects backed by Channel 4 was slightly different. In television, the opportunities were more immediate, especially on documentary and current affairs, given also the background of most of the workforce at the time. TV commissions were not exactly abundant. They normally consisted of one-off projects with small crews. However, they were constant enough to provide regular work to freelancers across production departments and keep the workforce going. In feature films, the involvement of local crews on Channel 4 productions happened more gradually and varied from project to project. Among the film commissions from this period, there were various large-scale projects which helped to create demand for new job roles and specialized skills in both creative and craft areas. Now I have some visual data here. The evolution of the freelance workforce can be visualized through a comparative analysis of credits from early Channel 4 features. We are focusing here on the 11 features from the 1980s, backed by Channel 4, which had some sort of theatrical release. Some of them were just released in festivals, for example. Didn't have like a massive theatrical release. In the table, the names in blue are from individuals based in Scotland, and in red from individuals that are based outside Scotland. The same with the production companies. Blue for Scottish-led projects, and red for projects led by companies from outside Scotland. So one of the first points to mention here is that how local crews were involved in these projects. In the very first commissions, the majority of crews are based outside Scotland, mostly coming from London. Only 1 out of 5 projects from this early period had mostly Scottish-based personnel. The basis of crews reflected the location of the production companies on both sides of the borders. So projects that were led by Scottish production companies tend to employ more Scottish-based personnel. As the decade continues, there is an increase in projects developed by Scottish producers and consequently employing more Scottish-based crews. Towards the end of the decades, projects led by London companies also start to show a mixture of Scottish-based and non-Scottish-based personnel. So what can be noted here is that while the location of the producers may have influenced the recruitment decisions, at the beginning of this period, the Scot-based freelance pool was not very extensive and lacked in many areas of expertise associated with narrative features. For example, across the art department, costume, makeup. And as the decade progresses, the workforce starts to expand and new roles start to be performed by local crew personnel. So another point to mention here is that various Scottish-based freelancers appear in different productions over the decades. Some also progress from entry-level to more senior roles, which may suggest patterns of career sustainability and progression. So a further point here is that while we can consider the evolution of the freelance workforce as a whole, there are differences in the pace of skills development across production departments. For example, in the art department, also in costume, hair, and makeup, there is an initial prevalence of non-Scottish-based crews until more or less the middle of the decade, when most of this personnel became locally based. This seems to indicate that skills in these areas developed over time in Scotland. In post-production, however, Post-production is a particular hard area for Scottish freelancers to break into in this period. Editors are mostly London-based, and in dubbing, re-recording, and mixing, all projects employ crews from outside Scotland. A point to mention here is that during this period, there was a lack of post-production facilities in Scotland. The film band director of 1990 lists only one sound studio and only one cutting room. So there is also there are also external factors like this affecting the development of the workforce. So we have some figures now. In terms of numbers, there is a sharp increase in freelancers listed in Film Bang across the 1980s and 90s. The growth beginning as soon as Channel 4 arrives and starts commissioning in Scotland between 82 and 84. As the number of commissions and also the scale of the projects increase by the mid-90s, so does the freelance workforce. So in terms of skills during this period, Film Bang gradually introduces people listing in new job roles. In 1990, for example, the roles become more specialized, particularly across the art department and craft areas. There are also some new senior and junior roles, so we start getting more supervisors, more assistants, as well as broadcasting specific occupations, which were not there before in the directory. In the mid of the 1990s, it's possible to observe an even higher level of specialization as job roles start to reflect the skills profiles and traditional structures of large feature film productions, similar to many of those from Channel 4. So that's when you start to see, for example, first, second, and third assistant director. We have start to see more managers, more supervisors, and very specific roles such as a fight direction or location scouts, very specific to large productions. So here you have some reference. And in conclusion, then, since the arrival of Channel 4 40 years ago, the freelance film and television workforce in Scotland has changed a lot in terms of numbers, skill sets, and organization. Channel 4, of course, was not responsible for this alone. Nonetheless, it offered the fundamental conditions to kickstart and then sustain this transformation. Many parallels can be traced between the sector of 1982 and today. Once again, the Scottish freelance workforce is expanding and facing the challenge of upskilling to meet the requirements of a fast-changing sector. In the same way that Channel 4 back then enabled many Scottish freelancers to break into feature film and television production and expand their skills in these areas, it has been supporting freelancers today in developing their careers across new genres and formats of content, for example, projects for high-end television. So this suggests that Channel 4 has not only had, but continues to have a vital role in fostering talent within the Scottish screen sector. And now back to Alistair.
Thanks. Thank you, Nelson. Thanks for clarifying. It was clearly transformative for the Scottish freelance workforce, but it was also transformative for Scottish companies. And from the outset, there were interventions to support the infrastructure of the local industry, preempting by several decades the recent initiatives for nations and regions introduced following the move of the headquarters to Leeds. These began with local Scottish briefings led by CEO Jeremy Isaacs in the 1980s. From 1981-82, Isaacs and the other commissioning editors came to Scotland. They came to Scotland to brief local producers. And there were commissioning editors Long before Joe Street, commissioning editors were given direct responsibility for liaising with the Scottish companies. First, Mike Bolland, a Scot who was based in Charlotte Street, commissioning entertainment. He was followed after a couple of years by Michael Atwell, and they were the channel's face in Scotland. Other interventions included ring-fenced commissioning for some strands to support the development of new talent. In the Current Affairs Department, this led to a series entitled Down the Line, and later the documentary strands Scottish Eye. The direct connection was consolidated with the opening of a Glasgow office in the mid-1990s. So all the celebration of the Creative Hub in 2019 had been preempted by a significant office more than 20 years before that. And that was led by commissioning editor Stuart Cosgrove. As I think Nelson's argued, in the early days, the Scottish Screens cluster could already demonstrate production experience, arguably more than any other UK region outside of London. And everyone in the small nascent cluster was well known to the channel's boss. Isaacs had spent a year in Glasgow producing A Sense of Freedom just before his bid to become chief executive of Channel 4. We can see it with as well as the rise in the freelance workforce we saw in Nelson's graph, the number of independent production companies grew from 16 in 1982, 29 by 1986, 39 by 1990. And it continued. The number of companies continued to grow through the 1990s. But only a tiny number of those companies produced volume of output. It wasn't really possible for all but a few to sustain continuing existence. Another factor that we've seen, as I think it was clear from Nelson's kind of explanation of the breadth of the workforce, was the importance of commissioning programs across genres and departments. With the remit to be different, commissions included programs with a Scottish perspective. Sometimes it seemed that every one of the companies in Scotland was given an opportunity. Johnny's run through the range of drama projects, beginning with Living Apart Together. Others included Ill Fares the Land, which was mentioned, about the evacuation of St Kilda. It was produced and directed by, written and directed by Bill Bryden, and made by Scottish Television. Interestingly, the only real ongoing drama commission for the channel at the moment is Screw, also made by Scottish Television Productions. But from the beginning, Scottish independents were developing new types of programming. Years ahead, a long-running afternoon magazine series aimed at the over-60s was an early commission by Naomi Sargent from Steve Clark Hall's Skyline Productions. Unsurprisingly, the daytime schedule and low-budget, high-volume series are now the key feature of productions from Scotland, with examples like Love It or List It from Raise the Roof and Hoarder SOS from Lions Scotland. But the shift has been away from magazine-style programming to repeatable, non-scripted formats. Back in the 1980s, there were significant commissions from the channel for arts and documentary programs. Scotch Myths from Murray Grigger and Tree of Liberty from Tim Neat. There are also music programs, Pellicular Films Making How to Be Celtic and Down Home, tracing the links between Scottish and American folk music traditions. There were also startup companies back in the 1980s. Freeway Films was set up by John McGrath, who had worked on Z-Cars alongside Channel 4 drama commissioner David Rose. Throughout the 1970s, McGrath's focus had been working as a writer-director with 784 Theatre Company, but from 1984, he shifted his attention back to the screen and made a range of programs for Channel 4, beginning with a series called Poets and People. Freeway Films was then the first Scottish company to win a 3-part drama series for Channel 4 with an adaptation of his play Blood Red Roses. Another new company, Big Star in a Wee Picture, was established by director Don Coutts and producer Stuart Cosgrove. They were Scots who, in 1988, chose to return from London and to create a startup business because they identified the advantages in a Glasgow base for building their company. An early commission for them was the entertainment series Halfway to Paradise. And they also secured a commission for an all-day outside music broadcast, a celebration called the Big Day, a celebration as part of Glasgow's year as European City of Culture. Coutts and Cosgrove went their separate ways, but 3 decades on, there's a current tender for Screen Scotland, together with Channel 4, aiming to find that elusive format for an entertainment show, and there's a competition now for a programme that they hope will be piloted over the Christmas period. Investment in local companies in Scotland isn't new. It's not a new nations and regions policy. It goes back to the 1980s. Currently, through the Indie Growth Fund, 3 Scottish companies based in Scotland are part of the scheme. Two Rivers Media, Firecrest, and Freedom Scripted. They show the kind of strength in documentary which was familiar back in the 1980s. Firecrest are in production with a program for secret history about the links between the Soviet Union and the disappearance of MP John Stonehouse. And Two Rivers have produced a one-off documentary about Marine A. But with both of them, the focus is on the lifestyle, repeatable series. And Two Rivers' main connection with Channel 4 is with their partnership with the Escape to the Chateau brand. Not really a program with a great Scottish perspective or Scottish identity. Freedom Scripted have got a development proposal to look at diversity with a Pakistani-Scottish writer developing a series called Southside. Back in the 1980s, the support for diversity from the channel to Scottish companies mainly came through the independent film and video department, investing in the workshop movement, commissioning the 11th Hour Strand, and also in films for people to people. And these included Westerhell's The Huts, The Work They Say Is Mine, directed by Rosie Gibson, and included it recently in the screenings that took place here as part of the FilmFour, Channel 4 at 40 season here at the NFT, and also another program, Lethers. So there was a range of different types of ways of representing Scotland on the Channel 4 output. However, throughout the 1990s, the remit and identity evolved under the two Michaels, Grade and Jackson, and the strands from independent film were axed. Scottish companies did continue to win commissions, for example, with arts programs such as Without Walls and The Obituary Show. And it was at this time that the major Scottish drama, Shallow Grave and Trainspotting, as outlined by Johnny, were supported. But the key thing throughout the first 2 decades was that there was support for a real breadth of different sizes of production, different genres of programming, different types of company. And from that point onwards, it was evident that there was a move away from the small regional indies pitching one-offs and short-run series. Commissioning policy evolved into the 2000s, and commissions from Scotland changed. There was no longer interest with programmes from a Scottish perspective. The Holy Grail was to devise formats for returnable series. Cosgrove became controller of arts and entertainment, and later head of programs for nations and regions. He encouraged Scottish producers to focus development on devising repeatable large volume commissions. Ideal World, run by Muriel Gray and husband Hamish Barber, succeeded. Location, location, location. They had identified how an aspirational lifestyle property series presented by knowledgeable experts Phil Spencer and Kirsty Alsop might appeal to the midweek, mid-evening Channel 4 viewers. And of course, location, location, location still continues today. And these property lifestyle programs are the foundation base of the channel's production spend in Scotland, with titles such as Kirsty's Handmade Christmas and Billionaire Blooms from Alsop and Spencer's own company, Raise the Roof, being the bedrock of commissioning from Glasgow. At the same time, in the early 2000s, with mergers and acquisitions and the increasing dominance of super indies, the numbers of Scottish-based companies have declined. This was seen to be caused by a low level of commissioning power based in Scotland, leading to that vulnerability and limiting growth for the sector. Of course, the hope is that the appointment of Joe Streep as head of the Glasgow Creative Hub will mean that some of that power is devolved. But it is clear that the sorts of initiatives have all been there for many, many years and are all being hailed as new strategies. And that just isn't the case. And I think that in order to assess whether there's any chance of them being successful and truly creating a broader and devolved production base for the channel will require an analysis of why those strategies, as previously applied, went in the ways that they did and weren't successful. The other area that I think is worth investigating is that shift in the kind of program content. There's really no content from the Scottish producers now that in any way reflects Scotland and in any way contributes a perspective from Scotland to the national conversation. And that seems to me to represent the way in which Channel 4's remit shifted completely away from that commitment to be different and to reflect voices from across the United Kingdom to a much more commercially focused and global media identity. It's no good to look back with rose-tinted spectacles and to be nostalgic about what Channel 4's launch meant for Scotland. But really, it's important to think what the conversation should be about losing those sorts of regional and national perspectives in public service broadcasting. How important is that? And is that relevant if indeed we need to have a conversation to defend the channel from privatization in the future? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We all join Okay, well, thanks to Alistair and Nelson for another very informative and detailed presentation, raising a number of questions that have parallels with Johnny's own account of Scotland and Film on 4. We've got about 20 minutes left for questions, so I'm happy to open it up to anyone in the audience, and I see Rod's hand going up immediately, followed by Andrew and then Eileen, I think it is. So should we start with Rod then?
Okay, I'll try and keep it succinct, because there's a sort of explanatory anecdote and then a question issue pointed at all the speakers, actually. The anecdote, I'm sure Johnny and probably Alistair have heard before, but it's worth saying in a forum like this, that in the first 10 years of Channel 4, when I was working there, there was a 6-monthly trip to meet Scottish producers for half a day or a lunch and an afternoon in Glasgow, followed by Edinburgh, rotating. And apart from the amusing fact that we were booked onto 2 shuttle flights, because like the royal family, they didn't want, it's like Liz's roof photograph last night, they didn't want the entire editorial staff at Channel 4 to be destroyed in one plane accident. So that was quite explicitly but quietly said to me by Liz Forgan as controller of programs. It was, she didn't use the word territorial, but it was basically about the spectre of S4C. It was basically about dealing with what had happened to the channel in relation to Wales. And although there was no quota, and although there was no, as far as I can remember, tally on how much Scottish commissioning was going on, there was the enablement of contact in order to try and keep a, I don't know about national conversation, but a relationship between Channel 4 Scottish producers. The 2 things about the interesting talks that we've heard this morning is, firstly, to Johnny, I mean, I can see why the coherence of taking Film on 4 certainly works for investigation and a talk like yours, but by omitting the BFI low-budget productions and the experimental work of Margaret Tate with the blue-black permanent feature, or the work I think actually shot on video in Edinburgh called Tickets to the Zoo, or Asen Yellen to the Island. I mean, I haven't got a very good memory at this stage, but I can think of half a dozen other features which surely are part of the picture, even if they're not Film on 4s. And Scottish Myths is a essay documentary, surely. Okay, fine, leave that. The second thing coming at the papers would be really responding to Nelson. I can see the really interesting work you've done, especially when the colour comes up on the charts. But I do feel, and it probably goes towards Andrew Spicer and Steve Presence in Bristol as well, that there is a real importance to say with economic research that it's necessary but not sufficient. And the quick example I'll point to is not Channel 4, but it's in the Irish Film Board, where in reconstituting a national film agency, it was absolutely clear that it was a cultural, political, and economic set of arguments that brought it forward into the government's, to government support and finance. And, the jobs and the incoming work and the tax fund and everything were the economic end, and Irish cinema was the cultural one. In the 10 years I was there, it's very easy to, with a broad brushstroke, say that the cultural and political was diminished and eliminated, and it becomes an economic, the economic research becomes almost an end in itself. And of course it's good to have people working in interesting ways, of course it's good economically, but the loss of some kind of cultural and political focus, which Alistair touched on in the end, is a continuous danger in neoliberal times.
Oh, okay, right. Thanks, Rob. I think maybe go to Johnny first and ask him by concentrating exclusively on Film on 4, have you missed some of the range of Scottish dramatic representation and as well as documentary work that kind of appeared across Channel 4 during the 80s in particular?
So there's limits to time, I suppose, is one thing. Within 20 minutes to half an hour, there's only so many things you can cite. But actually, one of the reasons why the question and comment is helpful, Rod, and thank you, that it maybe enables me to make a point that I should have made in the presentation, but on reflection didn't. So the three, if you like, the three sign of the times style case studies that I looked at and showed clips from were all FilmFour funded. Some of the other films that I've very briefly touched upon from the 1980s weren't. And I think one of the challenges of putting together a presentation like this is that within a feature cinematic ecosystem that historically has been as small as Scotland's, almost counterintuitively, Channel 4's influences not only manifest in what it commissions, but actually what else is commissioned by other people in response to the growth of employment and entrepreneurial opportunities that that Nelson and ALISTAIR have covered. So I was quite literal minded, I suppose, in terms of sticking to Channel 4 funded work. But you are right that there's another story to be told, and actually some of Channel 4's most interesting influences in Scotland are discernible within work that they didn't fund, or were, you know, very clearly minority partners within, but that arguably wouldn't have happened without what they were doing in the next room, as it were.
Right, thanks, Johnny. Maybe the second question, second part of Rod's question, I suppose, is for both ALISTAIR and Nelson about the correlation between the growth of freelance work programme companies and the decline of Scottish content to some extent. In fact, this struck me because I was throwing out videotapes the other day and I came across a recording of Scottish Eye, which included an interview with John McGrath. It was fascinating, an hour of Channel 4 on Scottish news and current affairs, which I'd almost completely forgotten about. So I didn't get the impression that you were dodging that issue. You were, you know, kind of measuring the rise of freelance and the rise of production companies. But are you going to correlate it with some sort of mapping of Scottish content and the issues of Scottish representation, which I sort of take to be partly at the heart of both presentations about how economic production and the kind of rise of economic imperatives is correlated with self-representation and the kind of significance of Scotland on the screen in both film and television?
I guess that Nelson's introducing, and I'll let him speak about it, but a kind of analysis of the impact on the freelance workforce of both of Channel 4 and the other consequent changes that happened in the 80s and 90s and led to growth. My interest is in the content and how the content changed and how, although it's the economic analysis now focuses on how much the channel's spending in Scotland and the ongoing increase. The only Scottish voices I've heard on the channel recently were, well, I said Alan Cumming and Miriam Malgolis did a little programme. Alan Cumming, it was made by Blink Films. You know, if a Scottish company was to propose a travelogue project made by presented by Alan Cumming, I don't think, you know, that wouldn't have got away at the moment wisely. Whereas if they focus on things in Provence, then they get a long-running commission. It seems to me that we should be talking about that loss as well, in parallel to what the economic consequence of the Channel 4 Commission decisions.
Nelson, do you
yeah, what I noticed in terms of workforce development, what happened in the 1970s, probably there was a big cultural discussion. It was before the Scottish devolution referendum. So I think the development of the workforce was embedded in this debate about national identity and cultural representations. But for the below the line workforce, they were not very much involved in this discussion. basically just want like more work opportunities, to expand their skills and have the chance to work in different sort of programming. As the decades go, like I know there was a shift from the cultural and the national identity perspective to a more economic perspective, which is what's happening now with this shift from the creative economies perspective.
Could I just ask on your figures, you said there was only 70 freelancers in Scotland in the 70s. Was that people working just in the film sector on documentaries, information films, tourist films, or does that include everyone who might have been freelance and working for BBC Scotland and STV?
It was basically people mostly working in film. Some people at some point, they would do some projects for BBC and STV, but it was very limited, because the production actually was very small.
Yeah. And your later figures, I mean, presumably the balance of freelance work is for television rather than film, or well, your later numbers, I wasn't quite clear the differentiation between film and TV.
No, it's mixed now.
Yeah, right.
It's film and television. Just in the beginning, the workforce would be concentrate on film work. Basically, there's not much opportunities for work in television. Most of the television work was done actually by permanent contract staff.
Right. Okay, I think actually we've got a waiting list. So we've got Andrew Spicer next, I think.
I'd like to thank both the presentations. I thought they were really lucid and stimulating. But my question really is for Alistair and Nelson. I've done some parallel work on Channel 4's impact on Bristol. And yes, it's true that those things were in place before Channel 4 arrived, and there's a lot of overclaiming, I think. I think you're absolutely right. But one of the things that several CEOs in Bristol said to me was that, okay, they might have worked with Channel 4 in the past, and that wasn't going to radically shift because they'd come to Bristol, but they all felt that it was a great statement about the city and its aspirations and its sense of itself as a regional production centre that could start to rival Glasgow, but some others, and be a place which might attract further companies and also other kinds of economic development. So, so there was this sense in which there's no change, but there's a radical change, because there's a kind of soft power change in the status of Bristol as a production centre. So my question really is, did you get that impression from the people you talked to in Glasgow?
It's ongoing in terms of getting feedback from the companies now. It's certainly clear that there's sort of dozen or so Scottish companies who are currently successful and winning commissions, the three that I mentioned who are supported by the Indie Growth Fund. For them, yes, it's positive, and yes, they welcome the close contact with the Creative Hub, with Joe Street. They're all focused across much more than Channel 4, and clearly we didn't talk about the multiple and international platforms that all of these companies go for. And it's difficult to compare that situation with the 1980s. But you know, by taking Big Star in a Wee Picture, which was an immensely successful startup company back then in the late 80s, and comparing it with kind of the position of startups now, that there's no one that has that sort of growth. By and large, you know, 3 of the sort of dozen companies are actually owned by bigger organizations. All of the companies have input either through Banerjee or Warner's or whoever, because that's how the business is today. And so it's difficult to get a real sense of whether or not there's going to be ongoing growth. They identify growth as being, the partnership with the couple in France for Escape to the Chateau, and that can sustain Alan Clements' business for the next 10 years.
Right, we got two more questions. Elaine, I think, is first, and then you'll be next.
Thank you for both the papers. They were really fascinating. My question is about the establishment of the indie producers in the 1980s you were mentioning. I'm just wondering, you know, in terms of the locations of where these companies set up, did they cluster around Glasgow and Edinburgh, or did they flourish around Scotland? Because in Wales, and I know the situation in Wales was different with S4C, you know, they did, companies were established across Wales. There were two major centres in Carnarvon and Cardiff. But, you know, there were companies in places like Porthmadog and in Aberystwyth and in a variety of smaller towns as well. So I just wondered if the independent producers kind of appeared in places outside the main two cities in Scotland. Thank you.
There wasn't the same sort of scattering. Predominantly Glasgow, some in Edinburgh and that central belt. One significant company was an Aberdeen startup, Turn Television, and it, like several of the most successful Scottish independents, started with, you know, a commission that they came out of the BBC, and they came with the Beechgrove Garden, which was already an established BBC Aberdeen brand. The producers set up a company called Turn Television, and they had that guaranteed commission, and Turn's gone on to be very successful. It has offices in Aberdeen, Glasgow, and Belfast, and has been bought by an international company. So they're an example. The Comedy Unit was another example of an independent formed in the very early 90s, but which was the team who'd worked inside at the BBC, becoming independent, and again, they have the same story, although they were Glasgow-based. There are some companies, particularly those Gaelic language companies, that are based in some in Stornoway and some in other parts of the northwest, the Highlands and Islands, but with a focus on the commissions that they get from MG Alba.
Okay, thanks. Question from the centre there.
Thank you. It's Margaret. I thought they were both extremely interesting presentations. I've got two sort of separate points. The first one mainly to Nelson, because it happened that I was working as a freelance editor based in Edinburgh in the first years of the 70s. And by an odd chance, I was elected as the union representative to go to London. And I was involved in the start of that kind of what led eventually to Film Bang, a sort of attempt to make freelance work sustainable. But my impression about the relationship with television is the reason why it was closed was not that you couldn't work in television. One would be called sometimes, but it was like replacing somebody who was sick. It's because the television companies had their own stable, permanent employment setups. And so when you talk about the increase, I just wondered about, when you talk about the increase in freelancers, how far was that balanced by a reduction in the permanent technical staff employed by the television companies, because it coincides with the casualisation of a lot of media work. So that's really a sort of practical point and question. The other more general point is I thought that Jonathan's description of the shifts in Film on Four's policy in Scotland was particularly interesting, because it seems to raise a lot of very general recurring arguments about how smaller countries outside the multinational conglomerates fund or represent or run their film industries, and particularly the kind of path from funding relatively small budget films, which are likely, even if they don't exactly have local colour, they spring out of people living in an area, and they have a kind of particular characteristic, and they're low budget, and sort of one in an awful lot of them may happen to hit the jackpot and suddenly become an international sensation and make a lot of money, but most of them have to be cheap because they can't earn very much. And the shift to trying to hit the jackpot with a very few, so that, but, you know, the phrase when he says, then we couldn't make our own daft little films, it's the sort of difference between enabling people. And I just wondered about parallels with other countries, because it had been my impression kind of back in the 70s and 80s that very largely in Europe, the first policy was followed. I mean, particularly in Germany, for instance, where the Länder spent more on supporting feature films than we did entirely as a country, in some cases, and that they followed this, and that there were a lot of very interesting films that you never saw because they didn't get international distribution, but every now and again, the result of that policy meant you saw a very interesting, distinctive film, which was one of the few that somehow got picked up and was very different from the films that the corporations meant. So I just wondered whether you saw kind of parallels, because I have the impression that a lot of those countries that used to do that have gone down the multinational road, and that people can't make their own daft little movies anymore.
Right, thank you very much, Margaret. Maybe just pick up the first question about freelance and the rise of freelance and maybe the decline of permanent employment. Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, as far as I could note, it follows the same UK-wide trend. After 91, probably, after the deregulation of the market, then we start seeing the television, the broadcasters reducing their permanent staff. In the 80s, not so much, because both STV, Scottish Television, and BBC Scotland, they also enlarged their drama departments, so probably they had like a more permanent contract staff. However, as I could note as well, it varies from role to role. Some technical areas, for example, like lighting, you don't see too many freelancers in Scotland, but there are more people that tend to be permanent contracted by the broadcasters. And from the 2000s, early mid-2000s, then you see a transition of people like leaving the staff roles and becoming freelancers.
Right, and Johnny, you've got the big question to finish off with, which I have to ask you to answer briefly, which is, I suppose, that sort of shift from small cinema to a more global, commercial, internationally orientated cinema, about the parallels, I suppose, across European and indeed world cinema more generally. I don't know whether you want to tackle that or just nod your head in agreement.
I'll try and do it quick. Thank you for the question. When I look back at my own research in Scotland and make a list of things that's wrong with it, it's quite a long list. Somewhere close to the top is the fact that I've never done anything meaningfully comparative on Northern Ireland, where you work. We had some very interesting work from a Welsh perspective yesterday, and I think it's and this is even before we get to some of the wider industrial, continent-wide, global region-wide trends that you're describing in the question. I mean, even within British film and television studies and histories, any attempt at a comparative Celtic perspective, for want of a better way of labelling it, feels to me to be a bit of a glaring absence. So there is no, if you like, I think, substantive, comparatively minded small nations or regions perspective that's really firmly and prominently embedded within British film and television history, and that's a missed opportunity, I think.
Okay, I'd like to carry on this conversation, but we're running out of time and have to let the next panel in. So I'd like to thank our panelists very much indeed for very thoughtful and stimulating presentations, and thank you all for joining the conversation.
Hello and welcome to the lunchtime session of the Channel 4 Now conference. I want to introduce Professor Dan Jackson from Bournemouth University, who's going to be talking about the Rio 2016 Paralympics coverage of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody, my name is Dan. I'm here on behalf of my colleagues, Professor Michael Silk and Dr. Emma Pullen. Mike's from Bournemouth University, Emma from Loughborough. Both couldn't be here today, but were central to this project. And we're talking about the 2016 Paralympics in particular because we did a 3-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council around that. But I will be, in order to understand the 2016 Paralympics, the story starts in 2012 and slightly before that one, when they won the rights for the Paralympics. So here's a brief overview of the project that we did. It was an empirical project over 3 years where we collected 24 interviews with Channel 4 employees in the production side and also from Sunset and Vine, who were who did the main production of the Paralympics. We also did audience focus groups with 216 audience members and a survey of a nationally representative sample. There's WP means work package, sorry, technical from academic project speak. We also did qualitative and quantitative content analysis of their actual coverage for the full 2016 Paralympics, as well as some archival analysis, and then we did a documentary film and public exhibition. I wasn't planning on talking about those 3 today for the sake of time and parsimony. I'll just be mainly talking about the 2 at the top. So this, I think, will be a familiar story to most people here, but I will rehearse some of it anyway, just in case you're not so familiar with it. Channel 4 took over the rights for the Paralympics for the 2012 Games, the London Games, of course. It was previously held by BBC, who largely relied on highlights and, in comparison to Channel 4, put far less airtime towards it. But not only on pure airtime, the whole feel of and strategy of Channel 4's approach to Paralympics was very different to the BBC's, and that's what I'll be talking about in the first part of this. So what were some of the features of Channel 4's coverage that were different to how it had been done before? Okay, so now I'm talking about 2012, but obviously it connects to 2016 and beyond in terms of the 2020 Tokyo Games too. So first of all, unprecedented amount of exposure. You know, all of their schedules were assigned to Paralympics on their main channels and online, which was a huge difference. A side note here, which is a thread which we may pull on later on if you want to in discussion, but a side note is just on, it's just you notice the names here and the way it's kind of framed to the public. It's framed by Team GB, by nationalism, by connecting audiences with our medal hopes. So you can see here, it only predominantly features any event where Britain's got a chance of a medal. Okay, that's not the point of this slide. It's a side note, but nevertheless, it's interesting in a commercial sense because they felt that that's one way of driving audiences. Is people want to see British athletes winning gold medals. You know, they told us that. That there's a commercial logic behind that. We might look at it with a more, critical eye and suggest that this can also be double-edged in terms of the views and visions that people see about the Paralympics. They see it through a national lens, largely speaking. That hasn't really changed since 2012 to 2016 to 2020. Just so happens that, Great Britain has a really good Paralympics team that is regularly in the top 3 of the medal tables and so on. Anyway, that was a side note. The main point was they handed over the schedules, completely unprecedented exposure in comparison to previous ones. They also took, again, in their own words, a no-holds-barred approach to disability. So their view, and I think, justified, was that in previous Paralympics, broadcasters had been afraid to show the stumps. The people who wear prosthetics and so on. They wouldn't show swimmers, for instance, walking to the start line. They would start the coverage from when they're there. That's what the standard outside broadcast coverage would be. When Channel 4 took this, they wanted to show people with no legs or severe impairments walking to the start line or crawling or whatever else in order to not sanitize the nature of their impairments. That's one thing that they had to do with their own cameras in 2012, for instance. It was harder in 2016 because it's over in Brazil and they had few of their own cameras and so on. But the standard outside broadcast, so to speak, the syndicated coverage that the International Paralympic Committee feed gives us didn't include lots of that. And so they wanted to not only show people getting to the start line, but also not be afraid to show audiences the nature of people's impairments. That meant visually, and that may include, jarring images that deliberately might provoke questions or interests from people, or even uncomfortable feelings in audiences. That's something which they were not afraid to hit us with. Okay. Another feature of Channel 4's coverage was developing disabled talent on and off screen. This is the 2012. Sorry for the resolution. It looked fine on my computer. This is the 2012 lineup, and it's evolved since then as well to try and be as close to 100% disabled presenters as possible in front of screen. But not only that, behind the screen too. That they initiated in 2012 and again carried it through the future Paralympics was talent schemes for disabled people in production side, not just on screen. Although many of them were for on screen as well, so that's where Alex Brooker, I think, came through, although he had done a bit of comedy beforehand, as well as I'm trying to remember the guy's name in the middle, which I can't. Integrating humour, and this is where obviously Alex Brooker is here, you can see on the screen now. This came hand in hand with the unsanitized, or at least less sanitized, visual presentation of the Paralympics. That if they didn't take the opportunity to lead discussion or to have a conversation around disability, it would be a chance missed. This again was a risk. It took, I think, again, remembering the interviews that we did with Channel 4, it did take some persuading to be able to do the highlights like this. There was also some serendipity in the highlight show that they presented in the end was the last leg, of course. And the original highlight show that they were thinking of doing didn't come together. This came together slightly last minute, but worked. Worked for a number of reasons, not least because the joke usually was on Josh Widdicombe as the only non-disabled member of that panel, but it also allowed a broader discussion around, hashtag is it okay? Which, again, they've carried on, and obviously this has had a life of its own, this programme, beyond the Paralympics. And then this, again, another particularly controversial aspect of the coverage was the repositioning of para-athletes as superhumans. You all will have seen these, I think, will have seen the advertising and so on for this. If our colleagues could hit play on the video, we'll watch this again.
Kick the bass for them brothers and let them know what goes on. Rolling stones in the rap game, not bragging. Lips bigger than Jagger, not sagging. Spell it backwards, I'ma leave it at that. That ain't got nothing to do with rap. Get up. Just like that. Get up. Just like that. Get up. Just like that. Get up. Just like that.
I know this is a shock.
Gangster 20 years later, of course endorsed while consciousness faded. New generations believe in them fables. Gangster boogie on 2 turntables. Thank you for letting us be ourselves. So don't mind me if I repeat myself. These simple lines be good for your health. To keep them time rhymes on the shelf. Live love life like you just don't care. 5,000 never scared. Rain and noise is the moment they feared. Get up, still a beautiful idea.
Thank you. So it may not surprise you to learn that, well, one, Channel 4 did a lot of work, a lot of kind of consultation work with I say the disability community, as if there is one, but nevertheless with disability activist organisations, as well as the athletes, in the preparation of this campaign, which I'm sure you all will have seen before. That was the 2012 one. And two, it might not surprise you to know that that scene there, where we move away from the elite athletes kind of framing to this is how many of them, or some of them at least, became disabled, either through birth defects or through military incidents and so on. That is the bit that jarred most with those stakeholders, and that there was a big fights over whether that bit should remain in. Channel 4 wanted it to, and that was part of their, I guess, strategy or framing of Paralympics, which is let's not shy away, or let's talk about disability, not just elite sport, and that came through, and obviously their broadcast coverage as well, not just the advertising, but the broadcast coverage where sections and segments would be given to various aspects of impairment and the athletes and how they got them. So this is in the words of one of the senior executives that we spoke to. So, it's not a tea party. Let's see it if you've had a terrible accident. And then they also talk about giving the Paralympics the Hollywood treatment, that putting it on the same kind of level as the non-disabled Olympics and non-disabled athletes that we celebrate in these ways. It also came from, it was interesting in the, I don't know if you'd ever made that link, we'd had some suspicion that some of the iconography or visual aspects of it may have had some parallels with X-Men. One executive kind of confirmed, actually, yeah, this was a senior marketing person who kind of came up with this parallel with the X-Men. X-Men, one of the themes is where disabled people are heroes, and it's fantastic insight because some impairment produces strength in another part of you, which is one of the narratives of X-Men. And this came across in, images like this. This was not, again, sorry for the resolution, but this was not an accident, if you know what I mean, that these does have some parallels with that. For the semioticians amongst you. So let's go back to remit, which has been one of the themes of this conference. When we spoke to the people in Channel 4, was central to the whole strategy and production of it. In their words, they couldn't have done what they did without that specific remit, because it gave them permission to take risks and to be different and so on, which, you know, sounds like, and of course, these are the words of Channel 4, and it's important that we look at these with critical eyes as well when we're thinking about the strengths and limitations of that remit. But nevertheless, in their words, it was what one of them said, a kind of total eclipse of the sun between Channel 4's remit and the remit of the Paralympics. For them, it wasn't even a Venn diagram, it was perfect eclipse. So yeah, it was about using the Paralympics to also make broader, bigger changes in society. Small side point, but just to say again, in 2012, it was, now we've had 3 Paralympics with Channel 4 where it's become, I would say, more mainstream, more normal, and it's been demonstrated to be commercially successful too. In 2012, it was still a risk. So what they did was reach out to really trusted mainstream brands like the Sainsbury's and like your BTs and so on, in order to try and lower that risk in people's eyes, because it was seen as kind of slightly risky viewing, in that people, again, our research had shown that some people are uncomfortable watching disabled sport. So how can we reduce that feeling of risk? Because disability, unlike some other forms of, marginalized identities, is something that could happen to any of us, today on the way home. So with that sense of risk that people bring to watching it, one of their ways to reduce that was through alignment with safe brands. And my colleague Carolyn Jackson-Brown has done a really good paper just on this, which I'd recommend you to read. So before we get onto to showing you the next clip, this is a bit about the evolution from 2012 to 2016. Many of you will know there was pushback and criticism from particularly the disabled community towards the Superhumans campaign. There was pushback on the sense that I can barely walk down the street or go to the shops or whatever due to my impairment. This Superhumans is bringing unrealistic expectations of disabled people that most disabled people will never be able to live up to. And when we did focus groups and interviews with some of these people, as I'll show you later, it still jarred even in 2016 that the expectations that many people in society and experiences they had with people in society brought from watching the Paralympics and this framing as superhumans. So anyway, there was some acknowledgement of that in Channel 4, and so what they tried to do from the 2012 campaigns to 2016 was make it a bit more about ordinary disabled people also being superhumans. So the first advert was, it was about the Paralympians. The second evolution of this in 2016 was much more about ordinary people, disabled people also being extraordinary and superhumans. If you could play the clip now, you'll see how that came.
Yes, I can, suddenly, yes, I can. Gee, I'm afraid to go on has turned into, yes, I can. Take a look, what do you see? 133 pounds of confidence, me. Got the feeling I can do anything, yes, I can. Something that sings in my blood is telling me, yes, I can. I was just born today, I can go all the way, yes, I can. can. Yes, I 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 can.
Hey, yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can! Are you ready? I can climb Everest. Yes, I can. I can fight here all night and never rest. Yes, I can. I was just born today. I can go all the way. Yes! I can.
Thank you. I know my colleague Catherine's in the audience who's got who's done, semiotic analyses of these. So this may be something we can take up in discussion in terms of the evolution of those adverts. But you can see, obviously, one of at the headline level at least, an evolution from 2012 where it's more emphasis on everyday people. Also, a nod to Tory austerity in the no, you can't. Although it just says careers, it could easily be the Department of Work and Pensions. This was and I'm not going to show the whole advert for the 2020 Tokyo Paralympics. I say 2020 because that was still what it was called, even though it was held in 21. But there was a common thread of pushback still particularly from disabled audiences, even after 2016 and through 2016, and I'll show you some of the evidence for that. So the evolution in 2020, which again wasn't part of our project, but just as a note, was again the de-emphasizing, a further de-emphasizing, I guess, of the super towards human, to try and make it more inclusive beyond just elite athletes. Okay, so let's move on to some of the audience data now that we did. So what I've just the interviews that we did alongside some of the visible aspects of their coverage. We also did quite a lot of work with audiences, qualitative and quantitative. I won't go into too much depth on this quantitative stuff, but only just to give you the headlines, because I think it is really interesting in that there is, to me, demonstrable evidence that Channel 4's coverage, or at least when people think of the Paralympics, of progressive societal change in public attitudes. Okay, so what you can see here is a survey that we did of a nationally representative sample, and you can see quite strong agreement with most of these. The positive impact on people, on disabled people, interest in sport and achievements of Paralympic athletes, changing of attitudes towards people with disabilities, well over 50, pushing 60%. Over on the right-hand side, I won't overcomplicate it, but only to say that when we do further statistical tests, which you can do with survey data, we did t-tests and correlations and so on, tells us that if in green, if you were female and more, and if you consumed more sports programming, you are more likely to agree with those statements. If it's in red, it means you're more likely to disagree with them. So you can see a D there, which represents disabled people in our sample. They were more likely to disagree with statements such as it's had a positive impact on people's lives, that it's challenged their attitudes towards disability, it's given them more confidence, which obviously would be logical because they are disabled. But nevertheless, there is a theme where Y equals young, female, and those most interested in sport are more likely to be the Paralympic audience, to be interested in following it. Disabled people generally more critical towards the coverage, okay, and its impact in society, just as important. So again, following the Paralympic Games, you know, 46% of people haven't really followed. We might, you know, when I think about that, of where this was done in 2017, by the way, this survey, about, you know, over 50% of the population are interested in the Paralympics. That we haven't got comparative data in, you know, 2011 or before Channel 4 took it over. I would suggest it would not have been that high, nowhere near. That to me is one of the achievements of their coverage. And again, young people and those most interested in sport were most likely to agree with that statement. In 2012, or in the lead up to 2012, we did quite a lot of qualitative interviews with people in the lead up to the 2012 Games, separate project to the one I'm talking about today. But 3 of the themes that came from that work were these: that before the 2012 Paralympics, people were uncomfortable watching disabled people do sport, that they didn't like the way that the media portrayed people with disabilities in the Paralympic Games, and that it doesn't really represent Paralympic sport. In 2017, after two events, 2 Paralympics, my suggestion would be that these are not themes that are particularly, well, they don't stick anywhere near as much as they did in 2011 when we did that first piece of research, that there is a strong disagreement with at least 2 of those statements. With, again, female and young people most likely disagree with those statements. A couple of headlines from the focus groups. So we also did over 200 members of the public, various focus groups, including disabled and non-disabled people. A theme that came back again, which challenges one of the themes that we found before Channel 4 took it over in 2011, was actually they did generally see it as an elite sport event. That's something which means a lot to the athletes, of course. I'll leave them up for a second, then I'll quickly move on. Athlete stories. So I haven't really talked about this in the production, but this was a really important theme of our interviews, actually, with Channel 4, was they invested a lot on the backstory features of athletes. They didn't want it to just be, here's the athletics. It's, here's this person's backstory. And again, there was tension between the athletes who'd said, we're just athletes, please can you just show the sport? And you know, Channel 4's vision, which was to say, we want to talk about disability too. That means we need to know your backstory. We want to know about how you became disabled or whatever. And it's not just a story of sport in redemption or rivalry, whatever. There's more to it than that. So these are some of the, you know, the responses from audiences to that, where they say, okay, well, it's allowed us to relate to problems that they may have, day-to-day tasks and so on. So yeah, that was something which was a major part of their coverage, which also can be seen in some of the responses, largely positive to that as well. And of course, the evidence that I just showed you for the survey data of progressive social change also came through in some of the qualitative data. Again, people talked about how it had challenged their own attitudes, but I guess there's this claim that it has made progressive social change, which I would say is supported in largely in our survey data, but at least, you know, people that we talk to also say, well, it's felt like that more generally, not just my own view. You know, it's made me much more willing to try and engage with people I come into contact with in daily life that may be disabled and so on. The coverage of TV over the last 6 years has made them want to talk about it and understand aspects of disability and so on. And then also this aspect of normalisation, which of course is a word that Channel 4 used in their interviews with us, that's one of their objectives. That did come across in some of the qualitative work that we did too. So, you know, people saying that it's become more normalised. My granddaughter is being brought up with it being accepted and just on TV, and that people should be judged on their abilities rather than disability and so on. People starting to notice the more incidental use of disabled bodies in TV and so on, not just being in there because they are disabled. So yeah, Watchdog and One Show, for instance. But then as I've already suggested, if you're disabled, there is much more tense relationship with Channel 4's coverage of the Paralympics. So when we did focus groups with disabled people, this came through, but it didn't just come through with disabled people alone. I haven't talked about our content analysis of their coverage, but we did find it was heavily focused on physical impairments, that if you were in a wheelchair or if you had blades and so on, prosthetic technology, you were much more likely to get airtime. And that's not just in the coverage of the events, but also in some of the features that they did as well. Because, and when we talked to them at Channel 4, they did acknowledge and accept that it's a lot harder to cover some of the more severely impaired events because they're slower. A swim-in race might take, a couple of minutes rather than 45 seconds or whatever for a 50 meters. That it's not as, the spectacle is not quite as impressive and commercially viable, but also it's harder to make features of people who don't look disabled, people with cerebral palsy or whatever. And so that was one of the challenges they had in producing it, one of the challenges that we saw when we analysed the content, and some of the challenges as well that audiences talked about is that invisible disabilities were much less prominent in their coverage. And that's one of the pushbacks as well, of course. Disabled communities still, again, I say communities loosely, still felt some tension towards the superhumans. So here's 4 takeaways from, there's more, but here's at least some trying to bring things together. Some of the takeaways here is that remit, at least according to Channel 4, and we may discuss and unpack and challenge that in broader discussions about remit, at least according to Channel 4, the remit was central in giving them the permission to do it the way that they did, in terms of risk taking and the production strategies and so on. The athlete backstories were a key way of making the audience care. There was a commercial logic behind that they didn't know that they were going to be able to get the audiences that they did. So there was a commercial logic behind that, and also the focus on Team GB athletes is to make these people household names, make people care, and then they'll tune in. And then all of the other benefits that they hoped people would get from watching this broadcasting would flow from that. But again, there is a tension there between the commercial and the more public service oriented outcomes. From the survey data and focus groups, I think there's some pretty strong evidence of progressive social change. And Channel 4 have done their own surveys and so on, which also are kind of in line with ours. Ours, I guess, are more, at least totally independent of Channel 4's own research. And again, this Hollywood treatment that has run through their coverage has generally been toned down, I'd probably say, from 2012 to the 2020 ones, was and does remain a source of tension with disabled audiences in particular for the reasons I gave. If you're interested in some more of the work, the report on the right was the main report coming out of the 2016 Paralympics. We did one in 2012 as well, and that's the one I referred to earlier on about the interviews that we did. So there's 2 reports. Drop me an email if you're interested in reading them, and you can't find them on the web. Other than that, thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to questions. Have a sit down.
Kathleen, sorry. Give me.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ben. It's amazing research, and I think it's really interesting to see the evolution from 2012 to 2021 And I think it's very bold of Channel 4 to collaborate with researchers and to take their feedback on board and evolve. I don't think that's something that a lot of broadcasters are willing to do. So just one observation first, the difference between BBC and Channel 4. It's quite interesting to analyze the diversity and inclusion guidelines and agendas of BBC and Channel 4 in relation to the differences you discussed. So the BBC, for example, acknowledges that incidentality is something important to keep when you represent marginalized groups. Incidentality meaning that, for example, you show disabled people without focusing on disability issues. Whilst Channel 4's agendas and guidelines stipulate that, no, you should focus on issues of marginalization, which obviously relate to the remit of highlighting the voices of marginalized groups. And it's quite interesting how, when you mentioned the BBC seemed to cover the Paralympics far more incidentally and understated, while Channel 4 tried to put a lot of emphasis on the narrative behind the disability, the reasons why and how the athletes became disabled, and put far more emphasis on the disability as a narrative center. So it's quite interesting how this legacy still exists nowadays in their DEI agendas, and there's a tension between incidentality and non-incidentality. The BBC event called Reframing Disability last year was very interesting in that regard, because it talked about this tension. So what struck me about the 2021 coverage is that from the superhumanness, they went totally to representing the athletes in more ordinary ways. So you can see them, for example, training at home, their makeshift gyms, and in the domestic spaces. So taking them away from this kind of superhuman narratives to something which is far more not incidental completely, but far more ordinary, and ordinary here in a positive way that can reduce stigma and social distance. So, sorry, that was a very long-winded comment. Did you have the same feeling with 2021 coverage?
I can't speak from the same level of analysis that we did for the previous ones. As in, I was more, for 21, it was more just, armchair reading of it rather than a deep reading of their coverage. I think we know from having spoken to them that was intentional. Do you know what I mean? To try and blunt, I guess, some of the criticisms that they've had around the superhumans, which haven't gone away, and largely from disabled people. So that, I wouldn't, didn't surprise me. Wouldn't surprise me that was also your kind of reading of it. Is that has been slightly, not totally removed, but you could see in even just the image of it, it's the super bit is being, I guess, I don't know, reframed or rethought of. What you talked about there also did, it did happen in 2016, where they would show domestic, when they were doing the backstory features, some of them were about their home life. The cameras came into their house and saw them doing everyday stuff, getting out of bed, making cups of tea and so on. So it didn't just start in 2021. But yeah, it certainly, I think, is been a deliberate strategy to more feature that bit. And again, I guess to try and make this something which doesn't grate with disabled audiences, because that's like part of the whole point. I mean, the whole point is not just to speak to disabled audiences, it's to try and change society, right? And be commercially successful and so on. But yeah, I think it has been an important part of that journey is to get it right with disabled audiences too.
Thank you.
Oh.
So, the big saying is nothing about us without us, right? So did you find that they were, employing a good amount of disabled people behind the scenes to make the big important questions on how to best represent not just disabled athletes, but the disabled community at large?
In short, yes. But we're reliant on their word for it, as in we did interviews with and at Channel 4, where they largely controlled who we interviewed. Okay, so they were the gatekeepers of our access to Channel 4. Nevertheless, I mean, we got a good range of all kinds of people from the production and marketing and commercial side. But when we interviewed them in I think it was in 2016. Yeah, 2016, I think. It was the year of disability in Channel 4, where it was a year-long campaign to not only feature programs about disabled people, but also put them behind the camera. So, as I said, in the run-up to 2012, there was a big project behind the scenes to try and get disabled people producing as well as in front of camera, because the in front of camera is quite an easy bit. You know, in terms of the numbers involved, you're talking about half a dozen versus, you know, dozens behind the camera and so on. And I think their target, and again, this don't quote me on this, but I think their target was for 1/3 of disabled people behind the camera in 2012, and I think it was 50%. I'm looking at Caitlin here. If you know, 50% for 2016, and I think both times they just about met it. 2020/21, I couldn't say because we didn't do that study then, but that's if that is the, and I think they did reach it both times. We might say that's, I don't know, I'd be interested in, you know, that's not bad, given that we know that there are far, you know, if you've got an impairment and you're in the TV and broadcasting sector, it's much less likely to get a job. It's much more difficult to be employed. So a broader question is, beyond the Paralympics, right? So we can say 1/3 or half behind the scenes for the Paralympics, but what outside of that? Paralympics is once every 4 years. Channel 4's workforce is incredibly diverse, but I don't have the data for beyond Paralympics in terms of the proportion of disabled staff. But I think at least in terms of the training and experience that those colleagues would have gone through would certainly make them more employable for work in Channel 4 and beyond.
But was it, you talk about Channel 4, but did you talk to people at Sunset and Vine as
Yeah,
well?
yeah.
Because I think the figures are something like less than 3%
Yes.
Within the kind of television production
Yeah.
workforce. So how can the intervention that the Paralympics coverage makes be translated? Because there's a bit of a kind of...
I'm trying to remember from that we had these conversations at the time. Obviously, my interviews were in 2016 and 2017. I was a young man then, not a grey hair. I'm pretty sure Channel 4 kind of mandated, or it was part of the contract with Sunset and Vine, you must employ X number of disabled people in doing this production. But of course, it's in production companies kind of come and go, and I'm pretty sure they didn't use Sunset and Vine in 2020, the 2020 Paralympics. And again, I don't know that story, but I would expect it would be similar. That is in the contract, is that X number must be disabled, you know, behind screen and in front of screen.
Do you know if that carries over into senior level positions?
I know that the...
Yeah, at Channel 4 or at the production? No, it would have to be at Channel 4, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't. Sorry. Yeah.
I think the Ofcom report from last year reports of very low levels throughout the industry of disabled people, particularly at a senior level, because they're, and I think that's what, you know, what I don't want to kind of do down the coverage, which of course is a fine thing. If it doesn't translate, if it's a kind of shop window that is that nothing substantive is happening behind, then should we really be lauding Channel 4 for its coverage?
It's a good question. I mean, and I'll leave it open, but only to say, could they argue? And I'm not a Channel 4 spokesperson here, but could they argue? Look, before we did these various, initiatives and training and so on for a new generation of behind the camera or behind the scenes talent, that it may take a generation for them to get to those more senior positions, and that this is something we've at least contributed to. But yeah, as I said, that like the Paralympics is somewhat ephemeral, and it's every 4 years. So what happens to all of those people in the meantime? Well, they've got more experience and training than they did before, but it doesn't mean that doors just open. And it's beyond that. Then I think becomes beyond Channel 4 because, the nature of their production. It's so yeah,
I think it's a question of, are there people at Channel 4 making the big decisions that don't go away after, what is it, 2 weeks?
Yeah.
Well, there are D&I leads, but it's how effective they are. I think Nick had a question, and then we'll come back.
Thank you. That was a very interesting paper, and it was really interesting to see the trailers again, which I'd forgotten, but I hadn't forgotten because it all came back. You had some very persuasive data on how Paralympics on Channel 4 changed perceptions, and I did wonder, I have to admit to having no interest in sport, and I don't think I've watched a minute of Paralympics on Channel 4, unfortunately. And so I wondered whether your research had uncovered or suggested the extent to which those very noticeable trailers that I remember were all over Channel 4, you couldn't escape them, whether the trailers in themselves had as much impact as the coverage.
From the survey data, we don't know because we didn't ask that question specifically. From the focus groups and more qualitative data, there is probably an answer, but my colleague Emma Pullen did the focus groups and analysed that data. So I didn't. So I couldn't say, to be honest. What I would speculate is that, I think they resonated with audiences more than a lot of the rest, because people, including yourself, who didn't watch much of or very little of the coverage, that's what they saw. Because it was also the billboards, if you remember as well, especially if you're in London, they're hard to miss. So I would be surprised if they didn't go quite a long way to shaping perceptions and so on, and responses to it. And I'm sure there'll be data in our focus group data, but I just didn't do the data analysis. I'm really sorry. Yeah.
Caitlin, did you have something else?
Well, in terms of exposure in social media, I can say that the trailers were very, very popular on social media, especially within the disability communities internationally, and they were discussed very widely.
Yeah.
And I heard a range of different responses to it. Like some disability scholars in the US, David Mitchell, Sharon Snyder, were very, very positive about them. Others were more negative about them. So they were discussed quite wide. So there was an impact there. And like you said, that it may take one or even more generations to see actual social impacts in terms of the stigma being really, really reduced. but what I would like to say is from the content itself, from the representation of disability in these trailers, the change from 2012 to 2021 is quite interesting because it more and more adheres to models of destigmatization from social psychology that I'm familiar with. 2012 was not at all. It was completely creating this social distance. 2021 is almost like a case study for Gordon Allport contact hypothesis, which is there to reduce social distance and to destigmatize. So I find it's really interesting how the collaboration and all this data led them to go, the right path. So I think that's laudable by itself, this evolution towards a more inclusive representation.
Yeah. That it's a good, good point. And also, it did remind me of the international impact of that in the discourses of disability representation that, me and you both speak to a lot of people from across the world who are interested in these questions and conferences and so on, and it does often come back to those trailers and adverts. And I don't, on the other hand, I also don't know how Channel 4 would feel about that, or how always, again, thinking of our project, we didn't analyse those trailers. We analysed their overall coverage, and that's, I think, sometimes, for better or worse, the discussion and discourse around what Channel 4 did, and I didn't help, by the way, by showing them, it is often focused around those trailers, when actually, what they were aiming to do was across the whole, the whole of their coverage, the whole piece, where, there were a lot more subtle attempts to reframe disability and so on, and not so subtle ones, and ones which, beyond just marketing, you might think actually were, really progressive, even in 2012. Yeah. So beyond the Superhumans campaign, if we put that to one side and look at their actual coverage of it, we may come to slightly different conclusions. Does that make sense? I'm not disagreeing anyway or challenging your what you just said, or the take of others who've been following this, but I guess it is, there's a lot more work involved in terms of analysing all, God, I can't remember how many hours, was it 90? No, it was more than 900 hours of coverage, which is why we often just focus on those adverts. Sorry, I've ended up answering a different question there, but it did occur to me that, and again, I didn't help by showing them, but we often do focus on those iconic adverts for good reason, because people who didn't watch the whole Paralympics probably know about them. But yeah, I guess there was more in the broader.
But they linger because of the music as well, and the last leg, and that being very popular.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it's 1 o'clock. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.